One of them walked away from Hollywood after years of bitterness, betrayal, and backstage conflict that fans never saw coming. Another watched fame slowly disappear while personal relationships collapsed behind closed doors. One cast member spent years battling financial problems and emotional frustration after the spotlight faded. And behind the motorcycles, sunglasses, and California sunshine that made Chipes one of America's most iconic television shows, there was tension, ego, loneliness, and heartbreak, quietly growing in the background. For millions of Americans during the late 1970s and early 1980s, Chipes felt exciting. Cool. Effortless. Every week, audiences watched Jon and Ponch race down Los Angeles highways beneath flashing lights and endless sunshine. The chemistry felt natural, the humor felt real. And for an entire generation, the series became part of America's television identity. But while viewers saw friendship on screen, real life behind the cameras was becoming far more complicated. Fame changed people. Success created ego. Relationships inside the cast slowly fractured. And over time, several stars of Chipes discovered something brutal about Hollywood. The industry loves you while you are famous. But once the ratings fall, everything changes. Some members of the cast struggled to escape the characters that made them famous. Others watched their careers collapse after the series ended. And for a few of them, growing older in Hollywood became emotionally devastating, because the audience remembered them as young forever. But real life kept moving. Marriages failed. Financial pressure grew. Careers faded. Friendships broke apart. And the bright California fantasy that once made Chipes feel so glamorous slowly gave way to something much darker. Aching, regret, and the painful realization that television fame never lasts as long as people believe it will. And by the end of this story, you may never look at Chipes the same way again. When Chipes first exploded onto television screens in 1977, America instantly fell in love with it. The show arrived during a very different era of television, a time when audiences still craved charm, excitement, and heroes who felt approachable. And somehow, Chipes delivered all of it effortlessly. Fast motorcycles racing through Los Angeles traffic, golden California sunsets, police sirens echoing across endless highways. And at the center of everything stood two officers who could not have been more different from each other. Larry Wilcox as John Baker, calm, disciplined, dependable. Erik Estrada as Frank Ponch Poncherello, charismatic, reckless, and impossible to ignore. Together, they created one of the most recognizable television duos of the late 1970s, and audiences could not get enough of them. Chipes was not simply an action show. It became part of American pop culture. Children wanted motorcycles because of it. Teenagers copied Ponch's sunglasses and swagger. And millions of viewers tuned in every week because the series offered something comforting beneath all the action: friendship. Even during dangerous situations, Chipes rarely felt dark or cynical. The show carried warmth, humor, and optimism that made audiences feel good watching it after long days of work or school. For many Americans, especially those who grew up during that era, Chipes now feels deeply connected to memory itself. The sound of motorcycle engines, the opening theme music, the image of California highways glowing beneath sunlight, it all instantly pulls people back to another time in their lives. But beneath the easy smiles and on-screen chemistry, real tensions were already beginning to form behind the scenes. Because success changes people. And when a television show suddenly turns actors into national celebrities overnight, ego, jealousy, and resentment often follow close behind. At first, audiences never noticed it. Jon and Ponch still looked like best friends on camera. But off-screen, the relationship between the show's biggest stars was slowly becoming strained in ways that would eventually damage both the series and the lives connected to it. And as the fame surrounding Chipes continued growing larger, so did the emotional cracks hidden behind the Hollywood illusion. For millions of fans, Erik Estrada was Chipes. The moment he appeared on screen as Frank Ponch Poncherello, audiences were captivated. The sunglasses, the smile, the confidence. He had the kind of charisma television rarely creates naturally. Ponch was cool, without trying, funny, without forcing it. And during the peak years of Chipes, Erik Estrada became one of the biggest television stars in America almost overnight. Women adored him. Magazines put him on their covers constantly. Children wanted to be him. And Hollywood suddenly treated him like the future. But fame that rises too quickly often comes with consequences nobody sees at first. Behind the scenes, Estrada's growing popularity slowly began changing the atmosphere around the show. As his celebrity status exploded, tension reportedly grew between him and other members of the cast, especially Larry Wilcox. The friendship audiences believed in on-screen was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain off-screen. Ego entered the picture. Competition entered the picture. And eventually resentment followed. At the same time, Erik Estrada himself was struggling under the enormous pressure of sudden fame. The industry pushed him relentlessly as a sex symbol. Interviews focused more on his appearance than his talent. Public attention followed him everywhere. And perhaps worst of all, Hollywood slowly stopped seeing Erik Estrada as a real person. To millions of viewers, he simply became Ponch. That kind of fame can feel powerful in the beginning. But over time, it becomes a trap. Because once an actor becomes too iconic in one role, the industry often refuses to imagine them as anything else. After Chypes reached its peak, Estrada faced growing frustration trying to expand beyond the character that made him famous. Offers became repetitive. Public expectations became exhausting. And behind the glamorous image television sold to audiences, his personal life was becoming increasingly unstable. Relationships struggled. Marriages failed. Financial pressure followed periods where work became inconsistent. And as the years passed, the painful reality of Hollywood slowly became unavoidable. The same industry that once treated him like a superstar had already begun moving on. Perhaps nothing symbolized that emotional decline more than the growing backstage conflict between Estrada and Larry Wilcox. Rumors of tension spread constantly during the later years of Chypes. Interviews became colder. Mutual frustration became harder to hide. And audiences who loved the chemistry between Jon and Ponch had no idea how fractured things were becoming behind the cameras. Eventually, the pressure exploded publicly. Estrada temporarily walked away from the series during contract disputes and behind-the-scenes turmoil. For a moment, one of the biggest stars on television risked losing everything that made him famous. And although he eventually returned, something had already changed. The magic no longer felt completely intact. As the years passed after Chypes ended, Erik Estrada continued searching for ways to reinvent himself. He appeared in reality television, commercials, Spanish-language programming, and public appearances connected to nostalgia culture. But no matter where life took him, one truth followed him forever. To America, he would always be Ponch. And perhaps that became both the greatest blessing and the greatest curse of his entire life. Because while millions still recognized his face instantly, very few understood the emotional cost of spending decades trapped inside a younger version of yourself the world refuses to let go of. But while Erik Estrada battled the pressures of fame publicly, another member of the Chypes cast was quietly growing more bitter toward Hollywood itself, and his story would become even more emotionally complicated. If Erik Estrada became the flashy face of Chypes, then Larry Wilcox became its emotional stability. As Officer John Baker, Wilcox represented discipline, honesty, and quiet strength. He was the grounded partner who balanced Ponch's reckless charm, and together, the two actors created chemistry audiences trusted completely. To viewers, Jon and Ponch looked inseparable, but behind the scenes, reality was becoming far more tense than anyone imagined. As Chypes exploded in popularity, Erik Estrada's celebrity status quickly began overshadowing nearly everyone else connected to the series. Magazine covers, interviews, fan attention, much of the spotlight shifted heavily toward Estrada, while Wilcox slowly faded into the background despite being equally important to the success of the show. And over time, that imbalance reportedly created deep frustration. The two stars were very different personalities from the beginning. Estrada thrived on attention. Wilcox was quieter, more reserved, and often uncomfortable with Hollywood culture itself. As fame intensified, so did the emotional distance between them. Rumors of backstage conflict spread constantly during later seasons. Some reports claimed communication between the actors became increasingly strained. Others described arguments over contracts, screen time, and creative control. Whatever the full truth may have been, one thing became clear. The friendship audiences believed in so deeply on screen was slowly collapsing behind the cameras. And perhaps that emotional fracture damaged Larry Wilcox more than people realized. Because unlike some television stars who endlessly chase celebrity status, Wilcox seemed to grow increasingly disillusioned with Hollywood itself. The industry that once promised success and admiration gradually became exhausting, competitive, and emotionally draining. Eventually, he stepped away from Chipes before the series fully ended. And once he left, audiences immediately felt the difference. The chemistry was gone. The emotional core of the show no longer felt complete. But leaving Chipes did not magically create a happier life afterward. Like many actors trapped inside an iconic television role, Wilcox struggled to fully escape John Baker in the public imagination. Career opportunities became limited. Fame slowly faded. And the emotional transition from television success to ordinary life proved far more difficult than audiences understood. As the years passed, Wilcox also faced personal and legal troubles that further complicated his later life. Financial pressure, public scrutiny, and controversy slowly replaced the clean-cut image viewers remembered from television. And perhaps that contrast became one of the saddest parts of all. America remembered John Baker as calm, dependable, and morally grounded. But Larry Wilcox himself was aging inside an industry that rarely shows mercy to actors once their peak years disappear. Fans who see him today often notice something bittersweet in his expression. Not anger, not regret exactly, just the quiet exhaustion of someone who experienced how quickly Hollywood can change once the spotlight moves elsewhere. Because television fame creates an illusion that success lasts forever. But eventually, the ratings fall. The audience grows older. And the people once adored by millions are left trying to rebuild identities outside characters the world refuses to forget. Yet somehow the emotional tension surrounding Chipes was still growing even darker. Because while the stars battled ego, fading fame, and fractured friendships, other members of the cast were quietly facing personal struggles the audience never saw coming. To audiences watching Chipes during its peak years, the show looked almost perfect. Bright sunshine, fast motorcycles, easy humor, confident heroes racing through Los Angeles beneath endless blue skies. Everything about the series sold the fantasy of freedom. But behind that fantasy, several cast members were quietly discovering how emotionally fragile Hollywood success can become once fame starts fading away. Because television creates a dangerous illusion for actors. For a few brief years, the world treats them as unforgettable. Then suddenly, the phone stops ringing. And for many members of the Chipes cast, that emotional shift became devastating. Robert Pine, who played the calm and respected Sergeant Joseph Cottrell, managed to survive Hollywood longer than most. While many actors from the series struggled after Chipes ended, Pine slowly built a steady career as a supporting actor and father figure across film and television. But even his story carried quiet, emotional weight. Because while audiences recognized him from Chipes for decades, Hollywood itself had already moved on to younger stars and newer franchises. Like many actors from classic television, he became attached to nostalgia rather than reinvention. And nostalgia can become painful over time. The audience remembers your youth forever, but you continue aging in real life. Meanwhile, other cast members found the transition after Chipes far more difficult emotionally and financially. Smaller acting jobs replaced national fame. Public recognition faded. Relationships suffered under years of pressure connected to Hollywood life. And perhaps what made the decline so emotionally strange was how fast it happened. One moment, the cast felt larger than life. The next, they were struggling to remain visible at all. Even Erik Estrada, once one of the most recognizable television stars in America, eventually found himself leaning heavily into nostalgia appearances, reality television, and reunion events connected to the role that made him famous decades earlier. That pattern repeated itself across much of the cast, because Chipes became both their greatest success and their greatest limitation. The show gave them fame, but it also trapped them inside one specific moment of American television history forever. And as years passed, the emotional contrast only became sadder. The audience still remembered California's sunshine, motorcycles, and youth. But the actors themselves were dealing with aging, health problems, career disappointment, failed marriages, and the painful realization that Hollywood rarely protects the people who once made it billions of dollars. Then came the deeper emotional truth many fans never expected. Some members of the cast no longer even wanted to revisit the show that made them famous. Because behind the nostalgia audiences loved so deeply, certain memories still carried bitterness. Arguments, competition, emotional exhaustion, and years of pressure hidden beneath television smiles. Yet despite all the backstage tension and personal struggles, Chipes somehow continued surviving inside America's memory. Because for viewers, the series represented something much larger than Hollywood itself. It represented youth, freedom, and a version of America that now feels impossibly far away. But the darkest emotional chapter connected to Chipes was still waiting ahead, because time eventually comes for every television legend. And for some members of the cast, growing older became the hardest role of all. For the cast of Chips, one of the cruelest parts of fame was not losing popularity. It was growing older while the audience refused to let them age. In the minds of millions of viewers, Jon and Ponch still exist exactly as they did in the late 1970s, racing motorcycles down California highways, beneath bright sunlight, laughing beside patrol cars, looking permanently young and untouchable. But real life moved forward. Bodies changed, faces aged, careers slowed down. And for actors whose identities became permanently connected to youth and television nostalgia, that transition could feel emotionally brutal. Perhaps no one understood that pressure more than Erik Estrada. For years, the media celebrated him as one of television's biggest heartthrobs. His appearance became part of his fame itself. Magazine covers focused on his smile, his hair, his charm. The image of Ponch became frozen inside American pop culture. But Hollywood rarely knows how to treat aging stars once youth fades. As newer generations of actors arrived, Estrada slowly experienced the painful emotional decline many former television idols face. The attention became smaller, the roles became fewer, and eventually, nostalgia itself became the main reason audiences still wanted to see him. That emotional shift can quietly destroy people. Because once an actor spends years being admired by millions, ordinary life afterward often feels strangely empty. And Chipes was not the kind of series Hollywood constantly reinvented with prestige reboots or modern critical respect. It became something softer, a memory, a symbol of another era, which meant many cast members eventually found themselves living more inside the past than the future. Larry Wilcox experienced that emotional disconnect differently. While Estrada leaned more publicly into nostalgia culture over time, Wilcox often appeared more distant from the Hollywood machine entirely. Interviews over the years sometimes carried traces of disappointment and unresolved bitterness regarding the industry, the show, and the backstage politics that shaped its legacy. And perhaps that bitterness came from understanding how temporary fame really is. Because during the height of Chipes, the cast felt untouchable. Then suddenly, America moved on. That realization becomes especially painful for television actors because their younger selves never disappear. Old episodes continue airing forever. Fans continue remembering them at their peak forever. Meanwhile, the real human being continues aging privately in the background. That emotional contradiction can become deeply lonely. Some former stars adapt to it. Others never fully recover from it. And perhaps that is the hidden sadness underneath so many classic television stories. The audience preserves the fantasy, but the actors themselves must live with reality. Health problems, financial stress, broken relationships, career disappointment, and the quiet fear that the best years of life may already be behind them. Yet despite everything, Chipes still remained emotionally important to millions of Americans. Because for viewers, the series represented more than motorcycles and police action. It represented a feeling. The feeling of coming home after school and hearing the theme music begin. The feeling of simpler television before everything became darker and more cynical. The feeling of believing heroes still existed. And maybe that emotional connection is exactly why the cast's real-life struggles feel so heartbreaking now. because audiences never expected the people behind that bright California fantasy to carry so much hidden sadness themselves. But somehow, the final chapter of the Chipes story becomes even more emotional when you realize what fame eventually left behind for nearly all of them. Not glamour, not power, not lasting Hollywood success, just memories. Today, decades after Chipes first raced onto American television screens, the series still survives inside memory. The motorcycles, the sirens, the California sunlight reflecting off endless highways, and most of all, Jon and Ponch. For millions of viewers, those images instantly bring back another chapter of life, a time when television felt lighter, simpler, more hopeful. Families gathered together after dinner, kids sat too close to the television screen, and for 1 hour, the world felt exciting without feeling cruel. That emotional connection never completely disappeared, but time changed the people behind the fantasy. The smiling young actors audiences once saw as untouchable slowly grew older inside an industry obsessed with youth. Fame faded, relationships collapsed, careers became uncertain, and the friendships viewers believed in so deeply often proved far more complicated behind the cameras. Erik Estrada spent years trying to escape the shadow of Ponch, while also depending on it to remain visible. Larry Wilcox quietly drifted away from Hollywood, carrying disappointment and emotional distance from the machine that once made him famous. Other cast members slowly disappeared from the spotlight entirely, surviving more through nostalgia than through lasting Hollywood success. And perhaps that is the real dark truth behind Chipes. The show represented freedom, but fame itself became a kind of prison. Because once millions of people fall in love with a character, they rarely allow the actor behind it to become anyone else. The audience keeps them frozen forever. Young, confident, immortal. Meanwhile, real life continues moving forward without mercy. Hair turns gray, bodies weaken, careers disappear, friends drift apart, and eventually, the bright California dream begins fading into memory itself. Yet despite every backstage conflict, failed relationship, and painful emotional struggle connected to the cast, people still return to Chipes, because underneath all the action and nostalgia, the show captured something emotionally powerful about America during that era. Optimism, freedom, friendship, a belief that life could still feel open and uncomplicated. And maybe that is why revisiting the cast today feels so emotional. Not simply because audiences miss the actors, but because they miss the version of themselves who once watched them. The younger version, the hopeful version, the version that believed good times would somehow last forever. But they never do. The cameras stop rolling, the spotlight fades, and eventually, all that remains are old memories playing quietly somewhere in the background. The fame faded, the highways emptied, but for millions of fans across America, Chipes never completely rode away.